Markets have wobbled after US President Donald Trump announced new tariffs on imports of cars and car parts. He's also vowing to retaliate if Europe and Canada team up in the face of US tariffs.
Morning, Emma. Well, this is being felt right across the world, from Europe to Asia to the US. We're seeing big slumps for automakers right across the world.
Britain will be at the front of the queue for trade deals. Remember that promise? Well, Trump just pushed the UK to the back with a 25% tariff on British cars, the same punishment he's giving the EU he openly despises. What happened to the special relationship?
Now, the criticism has also been swift and widespread. We've seen the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney come out just recently and say that they will respond forcefully with additional retaliatory tariffs. That's because the US is the largest importer of cars in the world. About 50% of the cars sold here in the States are imported, and about 60% of the components for vehicles that are assembled here. So this is likely to be felt everywhere. On the US, we've also seen leaders in Japan and China hit back at this. We've seen the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen say that this will be bad for business and worse for consumers.
I'm breaking down why Trump sees Starmer's Britain as just another European puppet, and how the UK government's Brexit failures led directly to this economic attack. The warning signs were there all along. The so-called special relationship between the US and UK has always been more aspirational than actual, especially when it comes to Donald Trump. British politicians have consistently misread the situation, confusing Trump's admiration for British pomp and circumstance with genuine diplomatic affection.
Now, those comments have been met by Donald Trump threatening further heavier tariffs on the EU and Canada if they team up to try to do any kind of economic damage. We've seen Germany's economy minister saying that the EU needs to respond strongly and needs to make it clear that they will not take this lying down in the US. So that's sparking fears that this will become a kind of tit-for-tat trade war, which of course is in nobody's interests. Now, as with any tariffs, there is an option for car makers and businesses to either...
Let's be honest, Trump cares about the royal family and castles, not special trade deals with Britain. Look at what happened during his first term. Despite all the handshaking photos with Theresa May and Boris Johnson, what tangible benefits did Britain actually receive? Empty promises about a tremendous trade deal that never materialised. Meanwhile, Trump slapped tariffs on British steel and aluminium without hesitation. Actions speak louder than words, and Trump's actions have consistently shown that sentiment takes a back seat to what he perceives as American economic interest.
Absorb these extra costs or pass them on to consumers. Everyone is assuming that, of course, that they will be passed on to consumers. Ferrari has already said, for example, that it will raise the costs of some of its...
This misreading continues today. Keir Starmer's government made a pitiful attempt to curry favour by floating the idea of offering Trump a state visit complete with royal trappings. Did they really think dangling a dinner with King Charles would somehow exempt British industry from Trump's economic nationalism? The embarrassing proposition went nowhere, yet our government continues believing they can somehow charm their way into preferential treatment. The Nigel Farage factor complicates matters further. Many Brexiteers convinced themselves that Farage's personal relationship with Trump would translate into favourable trade terms. It's as if they believed Trump would say, well, Nigel's my buddy, so let's give Britain a break. That fantasy has now crashed headlong into the reality of a 25% tariff on British cars. Friendship with Farage might get you a MAGA hat, but it won't protect British manufacturing from Trump's America First policies. Perhaps the most revealing moment came when Starmer met Trump to supposedly discuss freedom of speech. There's something painfully ironic about Starmer championing free expression to Trump, while his own government pushes legislation that many argue threatens exactly that freedom. The contradiction wasn't lost on Trump, who reportedly viewed the meeting as further evidence of British political hypocrisy. What this disconnect reveals is that Britain occupies no special place in Trump's world order. He sees international relations purely as business transactions with winners and losers. The British fantasy that centuries of shared history and cultural ties will somehow translate into economic favouritism is just that, a fantasy. Behind Trump's decision to punish British industry lies a simple but brutal calculation. If Britain walks like the EU, talks like the EU, and implements policies like the EU, why should it be treated any differently? Despite officially leaving the European Union, Britain under Starmer has increasingly aligned itself with precisely the continental values and approaches that Trump finds most objectionable. Trump's antipathy toward the European Union is well documented and deeply rooted. He views the entire European project as fundamentally incompatible with American values, a bureaucratic monstrosity that stifles economic freedom and individual achievement. This isn't merely a policy disagreement, it's a visceral rejection of everything the EU represents. Starmer's Britain has fallen directly into this ideological trap. Rather than forging a truly independent post-Brexit identity, the UK government simply wants to get back closer to the EU. This realignment hasn't gone unnoticed in Trump's circle, where Starmer is seen as someone who epitomises everything they hate about Europe, an enemy of free speech, with lax border policies and an excessive welfare state. The philosophical divide runs deeper than simple policy differences. Trump's worldview centres on the belief that hard work and honesty brings you wealth and happiness, the quintessential American dream. In stark contrast, he perceives Starmer's Britain as embracing the European model of dependency, where citizens are encouraged toward laziness and reliance on government benefits. This fundamentally different vision of society's organisation places Britain firmly in the European camp in Trump's mind. Even British foreign policy decisions are now viewed through this prism. Starmer's proposal for a coalition of the willing in Ukraine is dismissed by Trump's allies as clearly a kind of EU thing. Further evidence that Britain is operating as an EU satellite state, rather than charting its own course. The tragedy is that this situation stems directly from the botched implementation of Brexit. The Conservative government completely screwed that up and delivered a pretty meaningless Brexit that failed to capitalise on potential advantages of leaving. The result is a Britain caught in the worst possible position, officially separated from the EU's decision-making structures, while still shadowing its regulatory framework and broader political culture. For Trump, tariffs aren't just economic tools, they're political messages. By applying the same punitive measures to British cars as EU vehicles, he's sending a clear signal. Alignment with the EU he despises will be met with economic consequences, regardless of historical ties or diplomatic niceties. So here we are, British car manufacturers bearing the brunt of political misalignment. What's particularly galling is that this outcome was entirely predictable. Had Britain genuinely embraced Brexit's opportunities instead of this half-hearted approach, Trump might have viewed us quite differently. Instead, we've positioned ourselves in no man's land, technically independent, but still orbiting Brussels. The path forward isn't merely negotiating better trade terms, it demands fundamentally rethinking Britain's post-Brexit identity. Do we want genuine sovereignty or EU-light status? Until Starmer's government makes that choice, expect more economic casualties as Trump continues treating Britain as just another EU appendage. What do you think? Should Britain chart its own course or resume the EU dance?